Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal. This is the Integral Stage, and you probably know I'm sick of talking to experts, integral authors, metamodern philosophers, and thought leaders. Yeah, I want to talk to people, the liminal folks. Let's meet Cole Giurlani. Is that how I say that?
Yes.
He's got some experience and opinions about psychedelics, plus he's got himself and his curiosities in his life. And I'm interested to know what the hell he's doing haunting these integrative developmental meta web so-called transformational spaces. Hi, Cole.
Hi, Layman. It's such an honor to hear that introduction. I'm always in awe of your diction and how you put things together. And I'm just really happy to be here talking with you about things that interest me and interest you as well.
What's the last song you listened to?
The last song I listened to, it's not really a song more than like a kind of a chant. There's a artist named Maylan on YouTube, and she does kind of this kind of voiced chanting type of music, and I found a lot of peace when I listened to her. What about you?
I listened to a song called Evolution Once Again by Big Data, which is sort of like experimental electronic band that often has other people sing their songs for them.
Big Data. I'm going to check that out. I tend to like that genre as well.
Yeah, they got a couple. I mean, because they hire different musicians to do different ones of their songs, there's a lot of diversity, but some of them are just gold. And there's a lot of, there's a big vision behind it.
Wonderful.
But how did you, what are you doing in the integral meta internet community scene? How'd you get here? What's interesting to you about all this?
Oh, man. My life is, my own, but I would say that in the last 2-3 years or so, with some healing journeys and psychedelic realizations, I came to question kind of the age we were in. And I remember one day kind of thinking about postmodern art and postmodern thinking. And on my algorithm on YouTube, Brendan Graham Dempsey popped up with his After Postmodernism series, which I just got to hand it to that guy. That is an amazing series. I love all of the things he does, but I feel like that series was voila. It's amazing. And I still find myself listening to it, familiarizing myself more with some of the authors that he talks about. And, I connected with him in some comment sections and was invited to be a part of his Metamodern spirituality group. And that's how I found you.
Well, what about these psychedelic healing journeys? How'd you get into that?
Well, I've always had kind of a recreational relationship with marijuana growing up. And I got really sick about 6 years ago while I was living in Japan teaching English. I had taken a trip to northern Vietnam and got 2 different strains of ecology poisoning, and got really, really sick when I came back, and it triggered some sort of autoimmune thing. And I had to eventually come back to the States. And I remember a few times where I was trying everything and I couldn't seem to get myself off of the medication that was sustaining me. And there were also lots of different side effects mentally that I was dealing with because of the medication. And at one point I was like, what do I have to lose? And first, I think it started with dabbling a little bit with MDMA and exploring a little bit with that. And eventually got more into mushrooms and kind of microdosing other psychedelics as well. And wasn't always pretty, but I found a lot of peace of mind in the journey. And can't say that my journey would produce the same thing for everybody, but I'd like to think my life, maybe something in what I've done could have some effects on other people's lives. What about you, Layman? Have you ever dabbled in such things? My intuition says yes.
Yeah, when I was, I guess, my early 20s, I was just really on fire for any kind of state change, and then that was one of the kinds. I was really attracted to large dose private experiences. I read a lot of books from the 60s, Storming Heaven, and all Leary's stuff and all the kind of academic research that was going on experimentally around this stuff. So my sense of how to do it was at odds with the people I knew who could put me in touch with these substances. I knew a lot of people who wanted to just take small amounts and have interesting social engagements. And I wanted to take really large amounts and sit in the dark and see how far I could push myself. I think part of that was a sense that that I had a pretty well organized mind. And if I didn't take a lot, I wasn't going to be able to get past that limit.
Follow-up question. Would you say that the large amounts is something that many people, if they were getting into this particular era, would you suggest that for many people, or?
It's hard to know. I mean, it's really specific to the person, right? You're taking a risk, but it's also possible that more people should be taking that risk. I don't know. I'm really on an edge here because I really agree with a lot of the people who say, let's set up the right container. You need the right set and setting, right? You need a good guide to take you through this. And that's true. And it makes it nicer. It makes it better. It prevents the risk of weird freakouts and that kind of stuff. Very professional, but also a little bit domesticated. And I worry, are we losing something? Are we losing that Hunter S. Thompson thing where people are just taking weird risks with it, right? Because there may be other territories about this stuff that we haven't even stumbled across yet. And so I do want some people to be to feel liberated to take that, even though it is a little bit dangerous. But I think if what you're taking it for is radical transformative affordances, you kind of have to do it that way. There's a lot of things that small doses aren't going to do for you, but in general, for most people, small doses of things is the way to go.
Wonderfully put, like always, my friend.
Did you, like I was saying, I read all these scientific theorists from the 60s before I did any of this stuff. Do you have intellectual heroes in this regard? Who do you respect as a voice or a thinker in terms of these areas?
Great question. I'd say as far as someone that's passed on, I'd say Dennis McKenna has been pretty much everything he puts out. I've been really interested in that. Another hero of mine is a guy by the name of Graham Hancock, who mostly talks about ayahuasca and DMT experiences, but also is involved with forbidden archaeology and things like that on the liminal or pseudoscientific threshold. But then another person that just came up is a guy by the name of Brian, I can't always pronounce his last name, Murescu. And he just wrote a book called The Immortality Key. And it's the subtitle is The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. And that book is fascinating. It talks about a lot of ceremonial wines and things of that nature, and new scientific research into those wines is that they contained different types of psychedelic mushrooms in it, and that basically we're all descended of mystics. And when it presents a lot of fascinating clues to why we drink so ceremoniously and things of that nature. So I'd say if those three people come to mind. How about you?
Definitely really respected McKenna, both for his experiences and his articulation capacity, but just the fluidity of his mind. I mean, I love anybody who can really be a contemporary alchemist.
Mm.
The interesting thing about McKenna, and you mentioned Brian, so you must have an interest in the deep history aspect of it, right? The role of these things in ancient civilizations, but maybe even earlier in that kind of McKenna conjecture about maybe these things catalyzed human cultural mutations.
Yes. Yeah. Are you referring to like the stoned ape theory and things of that nature?
Yeah.
Yeah, big time. I studied anthropology in college. So yeah, in fact, prehistory is probably the most fascinating thing for me, is things that happened before we started writing things down.
That's where a lot of my interest is as well. And I think it's, I mean, probably we all have a resonance with the archaic if we explore ourselves enough, but it also seems like this is a moment in history where the question of civilization is up for grabs, and we may be the archaic ancestors of whatever is going to come next. There's a lot of things we seem to have left behind. There's a lot of shamanic elements to how we need to be approaching the world that need to come back in. So I'm fascinated by prehistoric psychological mutants, and where I'm never quite sure is how significant a role the vegetable alkaloids and the psychedelics were playing, right? Because I tell myself some stories about the meditative development, or the role that sexuality played, or the role that the kind of alert concentration needed in hunting played. There's all kinds of meditative and contemplative and even yogic aspects to ancient life that could have generated the beginnings of culture and the beginnings of the esoteric lineages. Clearly, tryptamine molecules were playing a huge role in that. Whether that role was predominant and then the other esoteric practices came later, or whether it was sort of an adjunct, I'm just not sure. How central a role do you think these things were playing historically?
Great question. You know, my intuition tells me that they were a lot more involved than we may think they were. And you know, I don't know if there's any way to be sure of that without archaeological evidence of such things. But I think we were at the fringes of us developing languages. I believe that there was a lot more communicated through tone and through body language and different types of sound effects. You know, I think we can tap into that. If I make a certain sound effect, it might tell you quite a bit than if I used a lot longer to describe what I'm feeling. So having said that, I think a lot of these type of unifying experiences around a campfire, or where cooking was done, or in the morning or at night, or through celestial type of events that happened, I think there was a lot of connectivity. And I think that it's very likely that a lot of these types of things played a huge role in that.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm not sure, because I do so much around the kind of classical meditation and self-development stuff, right, that I want to favor that. But at the same time, it seems clear to me that the straightforwardness of the ingestion of these things makes it likely that they played an enormous central role historically, and that they probably have a similar role to play now. Is one of the things they seem to do. I mean, they have all these interesting effects that if you were a species who could get them, it would be worth getting them. right? All that McKenna stuff about, brain explosions, but also increased visual acuity. And everybody who's doing the microdosing now, particularly with the psilocybin, knows that, flow states, coordination, super useful in hunting or going to war or anything like that, as well as, like what you were saying, figuring out how to do different kinds of communicative processes, which itself has evolutionary advantages. So there's all that stuff, but there's also this notion that these are psychological upgrade substances, that they allow you to take a new imprint of the complexity of the world around you. That's why the CIA and Tim Leary and those guys were thinking of them as reprogramming substances. It's like you get a new imprint of the world. And right now, the world seems to be changing so quickly that the old notion of intergenerational development is clearly not fast enough. We can't wait for the kids to pick it up if it's going to change 15 times within every lifetime. So we've got to have some mechanism for a lot of people to very simply get up to date on where we are in history. And I can say, hey, you can do that, like McKenna would say, on the natch, right? You can do that through internal exercises. You can do that through learning and training, but those things are also slow. They take time and they don't work for everybody. If you had a tool from the biosphere that would allow people to do it very simply and very quickly and repeatedly, independently of how much internal development they were doing, that seems like an essential tool for enabling a species to deal with the enormous amount of emergence complexity that's going on now.
I feel so grateful to hear you put these words together, Layman. You're a musician, my friend.
Well, I appreciate that. Here's always a good question is, what don't you know about these things that you would really love to know?
What don't I know that I'd love to know? Well, I'd love to know what maybe I think some of the things coming out now with maps and, some of the articles about traumatic experiences and the benefit of mostly MDMA, but psilocybin as well in those things are something a lot of people that have been using them as healing have known for a long time. So going along that train of thought, I would love to see what perhaps like a community on a small scale in, as you said, in more of a controlled and intentionally guided type of way, what certain things could be discovered through perhaps one using one particular substance and one using another particular substance. So I'd love to see how science could discover a lot of the mysteries about this, apart from a lot of the socioeconomical forces that we have today. I think when there's money to be made, a lot of times the best foot isn't put forward, so to speak. So I would love to see more research done behind each of these things that didn't have a monetary value or worth to it, but more of a healing and unity type of worth to the human species as a whole, to the earth as a whole. I'd love to know if they have a consciousness, these substances, what they would like to tell us. I mean, I can use them and put my mind in place of what I think they're telling me, but I seem to think that we think we are the most developed species and most developed consciousness in the world. And, science backs that up in many ways, but, I also think that there are things that we don't have the tools yet developed to discover. And so if they do have consciousness, what they tell us. Can I reflect that question back to you? Because that was such a good question.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it, but I want to touch on the last thing you said first, because I think that's a really profound consideration going forward, right? Whether we treat these things as modifiers of our experience, where we're going to design a trip, whether it's for healing or to experience part of the world differently or something like that, versus, especially with the organic compounds, thinking of them as possibly being entity like, so that we enter into a relationship and pose them questions and, right, allow them to talk to us in our brains. Those are, I mean, you can do both, but they proceed along very different tracks going forward. What do I not know that I'd love to know? I mean, I'd love to know whether it's primarily a neuropsychological phenomenon or whether there's some kind of interdimensional physics involved. I'd like to know the degree to which the biosphere is communicating through substances, or whether the substances are just interacting with us, right? Or whether the greater context is communicating through them. I'd love to know, I mean, I hear rumors about neurogenesis and that some of these substances can produce new nerve growth in the brain, and that that's part of how they modulate trauma and depression. I'd really like to know if that's the case. I'd love to know how they relate to anomalous entities, UFOs, elves, that kind of thing, because on the one hand, it seems like preposterous there would be a connection. On the other hand, it seems like there frequently is an experiential connection for people. But I'd also like to know a lot more about how they relate to time. All right, because at larger doses, the experience of being outside of the time flow is pretty common for people. And is that something about how consciousness actually relates to time, or is that just like you hacked your brain's clocking mechanism, and so you temporarily can't process time sequencing, right? Is it physics, or is it just neuropsychology? Those make me really feel intrigued.
I like all of those.
Do you do work with others, shaman work or whatever, in this holding space, setting a context, taking people through healing sessions?
A few times. I'm by no means an avid practitioner. Before I get into that, I'd like to say that although I'm highly supportive of all of these things, I also practice quite a bit of feeling my intuition. I don't just set the intention like I've got time this weekend, this is what I'm going to do. Although I might think that, if I get to that time and it doesn't feel right, I tend not to do it. A lot of people or friends are like, how do you just have these things lying around your house and not be doing them? And so having said that, I really respect these substances. And I think that to have this reverence towards them implies some relationship with them as an entity. And whenever I've not been mindful of those things, I've found that I didn't get as much out of the experience. So usually when I've had the opportunity to guide someone through these kind of processes, I really check in with them. And even if we show up with the intention to do them, and it doesn't feel right, or my intuition or their intuition seems a little off on some ways, then we just table it for another day. And so there's probably been like 4 people that I've helped with this. And earlier we were talking about large doses, and I found that there have been a lot of people that try that first and have a lot of fear after that experience, and don't develop that respect or relationship with the substance. And so I'm very much more key on starting small and building up. And if eventually somebody is able to get on their bicycle and do a Tour de France with it, then I say, go for it, But I think some muscles are needed to be developed first.
Yeah.
for most people, maybe not all people, in my experience, before kind of taking the big plunge. And yeah, I've had mainly all good experiences. I can't really speak to anything that has been a bad experience. And when challenges have arose, I've just kind of been present with the person, helped them with breathing, helped them with opening their chest, attended to them. And everyone has been able to kind of rise above whatever they were working with or challenges that came up at the time, and had a wonderful healing experience in those moments. So I think as long as someone stays present and someone has a guide of sorts, especially when starting out, that it's a wonderful area to explore.
Yeah, that I think in most areas of life and for most people, start small and explore, see where you want to go. In my own life, I feel like I went the other way, which is I wanted to do these really daring experiments, and I knew I only had a window of courage for that, right? I don't know. I wouldn't do it now. So that I took advantage of that opportunity, and then it kind of decreased an out of my life in a way. I started to have mostly the same experience over and over again. And it seemed like the substances were telling me that they didn't really want me involved, or I didn't need it. They were just going to give me the same message over and over again. I heard Alan Watts say that too. Once you get the message, hang up the phone. I'm also thinking of McKenna said something like, sometimes you talk to people and you say, well, what's your favorite drug? And they say DMT. And how often do you do it? And they say every 15 years. So there's some kind of inbuilt timing mechanism that for some people will look like an increase, and for some it'll look like a diminishment, and others it'll just look like some kind of regular cycle for them. I think if we're relating to it correctly, we work out what our tempo is for handling these things.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone has to kind of refer to their own inner guidance on a lot of this stuff. As someone that is guided, like not frequently, that my goal is to empower that person to be able to go through these things themselves, not that they need a crutch or they need somebody to be there all the time. So I very much resonate with what you're saying on that.
I only had one bad trip, but I learned a lot from it. In some ways it was my most informative experience with these things, but it was rough. And I can see it going poorly for some kinds of people. So it's important to be cautious with this stuff.
Yeah, just to kind of
go ahead.
Piggyback off of that real quick. My particular what I've noticed with bad trips is kind of that thing where I was saying to check in with your intuition first. A lot of times there's something unresolved, or perhaps some part of ego life or something has a lot more a hold of the person than they may realize it. And this higher state of awareness may take them into a place of being uncomfortable or realizing they're not as authentic as they thought they were, or some very huge existential crisis. So yeah, I really believe that checking in with yourself and to not just state an intention, like I said earlier, I've got time and I want to do this, but really feel it out and really make sure that you respect the substance enough to know that you are ready for what's coming next.
There's an interesting element of that, and I really appreciate this call to check your subtle responses prior to the event, because they might tell you something about what kind of event it would be for you at that moment. a lot of people I find, and I certainly experienced this and heard my friends talk about this. Um, the trip starts before you take the substance. That's a very strange effect, but a lot of people report it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it's a journey that in many ways never ends in a destination. So got to make sure you've got your explorer's cap on. That's what you're in for. So
yeah, I wonder if that is, I mean, one way to read that is that the effect is not actually just from a substance or a molecule, it's a much larger energetic or informational process. But another way to read that is we co-evolved with these things. And so we actually know what to do. It's already started in us before we do it because of how deep the ancient relationship is between ourselves and these organisms and or molecules.
I agree with that.
Now, I'm curious about, I mean, there's different categories of these things, right? People often put the chemically produced ones in a certain category, the biological ones in another category. And among the biological ones, the mushroom ones are especially interesting, not merely because they're benign and easy to access, but because the whole notion of the fungus and the mycelium seems to be especially pertinent to the age we live in, the age of digital networks, the age of the mind understood as a network. So, I mean, in some ways, mycelium is the metaphorical archetype for the era that we're passing into. How do you, or do you think about the mushroom as being a little bit different than the rest of the psychedelic substances?
Yeah, very much. And I may get a little off tangent when answering this, but as you point out, you know, the way the mycelium works is very much similar to the way the neurons in our brain are formed, and the connectivity that we have today with our technology mirrors a lot of the connectivity you find on the forest floor when these mushrooms are used to communicate between different trees or different microbiological sources. I'm a real big fan of a lot of the, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but hermetics. And one of the thing is as above, so below. And so in that light, I think very much so the mycelium have a very important lesson to teach us, that we are probably just on the tip of the iceberg in discovering, not even just as individuals, but especially as a species. Where does your mind go?
A couple of different directions, but one of them is a little bit perverse, which is, how do we know we can trust them, right? Just because the effects are amazing. You know, there's so many people who, with ayahuasca particularly, right, we refer to it as a medicine because one of the things it does is help people get over addictions to other substances. Hancock gave up cannabis. Lots of people get over addictions through these substances. Now, is that because these substances are benign healers who know what's good for you, or because ayahuasca is a jealous mistress and doesn't want you taking any other drug, right? Or if you say, oh, I'm going to sit down and let the mushroom talk to me. Why would I believe a mushroom? For all I know, they're lying to me about everything, even though it feels amazing. Now, that's not my opinion, but I think we should be somewhat humorously and skeptically open to the possibility that we don't know what category of trust to put these messages in when we receive them.
I respect that question. And I think that each of us should be taking a, for lack of a better term, bird's eye perspective on each of these experiences. At the same time, part of me believes that there is a deeper wisdom. And also, I think ultimately every living organism's core motivation is survival. And I think right now we're at a very pivotal time for the survival, not just of our species, but for the diversity of life on this earth. And I think in that, and like I said, not every message, I'd say every message, you know, it's worth checking that in. But I think in general, as you've said, there's generally a more unifying type of message in a lot of this. And I think that has to do with the mycelium and this earth wanting to survive. And not just that, for us to thrive, for us to realize the abundance at our fingertips. So I don't know, that's
a strong incentive to cultivate us to be better stewards of the system. Yeah, that's plausible.
That's where my mind goes with it, kind of.
I'm curious how you think about assimilating and integrating these experiences, because that's something that's a very broad category. Like, it applies to education, it applies to, you know, all kinds of peak experiences. It certainly applies to the psychedelic experiences. Once it's happened, how do you make sure that it stays with you, that it becomes a part of your life and not just, you know, a weird vacation you had for a moment?
Great question. As a lot of my responses are probably going to tend to be, is everyone is different on this particular thing, and I'm no professional. But I think that is basically up to the individual in how that they decide to integrate these things. For me, I can only really speak for my life experience, and I was kind of guided to get out of the whole 9-to-5 job type of thing. And I went back home to my hometown, and I'm really lucky to have my family still here. We have an old Italian restaurant, and I kind of, my mantra right now are that my wants are few and my needs are always met. And right now I work maybe 3 or 4 hours a day. I make fresh pasta at the restaurant. I do all the book work, and I go and procure ingredients for the nightly specials. And after such, I have so much more energy to do creative things, whether it's bonsai or watercolor painting or experimental writing or thought generation. Also working on a little graphic novel in some ways. So I like I said, I think everyone's different, and everyone's different on their path, and no one's ahead of anyone, is my personal belief. But that was kind of part of my integration process, because I was finding myself kind of that my mind or something was on autopilot. And I found myself when I was at the precipice of wanting to get better and healing. And I found myself, and this was kind of in the midst of the Trump era and everything else, where I found myself in a place where I was projecting a lot and I hadn't realized it. I found myself in a place where I was like, I hate the hateful. You know, and saying that out loud, it sounds so silly now, but it was a place where I had found myself, and I was identifying with that. And so I think part of my integrating experience made me realize that that wasn't my goal of who I wanted to become, or who I was or who I was becoming. So I don't know. I think the integration is something each of us is a practice that is part of the journey. And as in that journey I alluded to earlier, it's not some place you ever really get to. It's a place that you're always working on towards, in my experience. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, that's great. You know, the notion of roots is coming up for me a lot here, where like obviously the vegetable alkaloids have roots. We've got the mycelium. We're talking about you sort of returning to the ethnic family restaurant, but we're also talking about the ancient archaic predecessors of human culture. So there is this sense of of the network of the ancestors coming to play with these substances, which is something our current civilization seems to be not very good at putting us in contact with.
Yeah. I sometimes when I hear you talk, man, I wish that you could be my personal interpreter.
I love this Italian restaurant, you know. So it's a Giurlani, something like that.
Yeah.
What's the key to making a really good pasta?
Well, I've tried a lot of different things, and right now, I'd say the flour is a real key ingredient. A lot of people just use regular flour, but there's a kind of a yellow flour called semolina flour, and it'll allow you to use just water and not need to use egg. And I've also found that when you use that particular flour, you can infuse things better, in my opinion. Like pesto, or you want to infuse some, real process, like in the food processor, I mean, like some different vegetables like red peppers or whatnot. And it lasts a lot longer. You can dry it. And with the egg, it only has a certain amount of shelf life. Whereas if you use the semolina in water, technically you can, keep it aged for quite a long time. I can't, if you dry it properly, I pretty much indefinitely, as far as I understand. So nice. Nice. Do you have any particular food that's tied to your heritage that you like to make, or?
We grew up really cut off from the rest of the extended family. Both my parents had come away from their families, so we were, making our own world in the wilderness together. So my what connects with me emotionally is not necessarily intergenerational food, but just the stuff I had as a kid. These biscuits my mother would make, bacon tomato sandwiches, certain kinds of cakes, all these. She would make a great chicken Kiev. I set myself the task of being able to make all those things at least once. So every time I would visit her as an adult, I would be like, show me how you made the biscuits. And I try to make a batch so that I at least was outputting what I'd inputted.
Oh yeah, I totally empathize with you there. The foods that we grew up with become such a nostalgic thing. I remember living in Japan, and at the time, I was the least skilled chef of my family, and they always had me in the front of the house dealing with customers. They didn't want to talk to people, but they thought I was good at it, so they're like, "Here, be a waiter, be a host, be a bartender," And I was good at it, but I didn't really learn a lot of these recipes. I remember when I was living in Japan, and I literally couldn't just get up and drive however long and go and have those things, and having to really pry to get some of these secrets and recipes out from them to be able to do it on my own over there. So yeah, I definitely empathize with the nostalgic foods of childhood for sure.
I taught a little English in Japan like 20 years ago, and there was a party just for the female teachers at this woman's house, but I was allowed to come if I wore a dress. So we went over, and they had the octopus ball machine, like a waffle press. Always just stood out to me as like a quintessentially weird Japanese custom, these strange seafood balls they made just in the living room.
Yeah, the food culture over there is amazing. I highly that's awesome you went there. I highly recommend anybody listening to this to visit Japan and visit the food culture over there. It's amazing. It's more than just you see in our sushi restaurants here in America. There's so many amazing foods over there. So,
and bizarre things, right? This kind of food you can get out of a vending machine. Or I went to a McDonald's that had like a fish soup burger. It was like fried, but there was like liquid fish soup inside in the burger. It was amazing.
Right.
Like pizzas with crab and mayonnaise on them. Just strange, amazing, beautiful things.
Yeah. I never had McDonald's as good as the McDonald's over there. Like everything that I would open up, what looked as good as it did in the advertisement. And as you said, like the soup, the fish soup burger, that was a thing over there. The way that like the McRib comes up or whatever every once a year. Every week there was some new rotating, interesting item there and worth checking out. So yeah, it's the food culture over there among many things is an amazing thing to
I'm really impressed by the way food wisdom is building up in the world. Like there's so many things that are kind of going downhill, but just the sheer amount of interest in the intricacies of different kinds of food cultures and the complexity and the increasing distribution of food nuance in the population is amazing. I love that. And at the same time, another part of me is kind of deeply interested and deeply disturbed at these hidden subconscious layers of how we relate to food. My mom would always tell a story about how she and her friend were traveling the world in the 60s. They were in Turkey at this guy's house. He brought this coffee. They didn't like the coffee. He flipped out completely. You know, you don't like the coffee. You don't like me. You don't like my family. There was like threats of physical violence, this whole thing, very disturbing. And the reverse happened when I was flying to Japan, which was via South Korea. And I couldn't speak Korean, so I couldn't really order food properly on the overnight flight. I just ordered the same as what this married Korean couple beside me was ordering. I go, just, yeah, same as them. So it came and I ate the food and they were so impressed. They're like, oh, you like our food? It was like, you like our culture, you like our country, you like us. They bought me drinks. It was great. But I thought, this is a low bar. Like, you can't trust me just because I ate your food. That is dangerous. You can't just welcome me in for that. I could be a serial killer for all you know.
Well, you know, you were talking about the roots of all of this. And I don't know if I saw this in the Cosmos series or from some of my anthropology books, but they talk about kind of the hunter-gatherer type of societies and, you know, also going along with, you know, being trained in some way to go to these recently discovered populations of people. I'm talking about like Papua New Guinea and certain isolated parts of the Congo with the Pygmy people, and how you must always accept what they're offering in food. And where I'm going with this is I think we come from a root of people that are generally warm and welcoming to strangers. And the more that what you said there about they could be a serial killer, although it may be true in the past, that particular idea I tend to think is more of a modern. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to know whether the danger has changed or whether they just didn't worry about the danger the same way in the past. I certainly appreciate this notion of the exchange function of the food. My girlfriend has a lot of problems with her mother, right? Her mother's constantly making food. And often it's food that we think is low quality or that she doesn't want, or she takes it as an insult, like her mother doesn't think she can make food, these kinds of things. And I'm usually putting a word in from my perspective, which is just take it. You know, we don't have to eat it. We could just throw it out later. But what we're giving her is the gift of giving us food. And there's a real blessing exchange in that.
Oh, that what you just said there resonates so much with me. For a real long time, I wasn't a drinker. I'm still not per se, but I found myself in situations where people would offer to buy me a drink or give me a beer or something, a glass of wine at their house with dinner. And I was sitting there going, no, I don't drink. No, I'm in this box. And what you just said about the giving and the act of giving, who am I to take that away from somebody? why wouldn't I accept a gift from somebody? Wouldn't I want them to accept a gift that I wanted to give them?
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, and within reason, obviously, but you know, now I tend not to keep myself in those boxes if I can help it.
Yeah, there's a real wisdom and a beauty to those exchanges. Now, they have this term prasad, which is usually used with gurus and saints, where you take them something, it's something useless. They don't need another orange. When they hold it and they give it back to you, this cycle is completed. I've always found that it's difficult for me to, or was for a long time, to receive compliments. I puts me on guard, like I'm handing over the ability to evaluate myself to another person. Right? If I get happy because they like me, then they have the ability to make me unhappy by disliking me. So it's a cautious thing. But the way I break that concern of myself is realizing it's for them. I'm giving them the gift of giving me something, which means I have to gracefully receive it somehow.
Do you? This is a bit of a tangent, but are you interested in the idea of love languages at all, and how different people have different things? I know words of affirmation is one of them, and perhaps it that particular one doesn't have as much of an effect with you where it might with other people, and so by allowing them to give you words of affirmation, you're accepting their love, whereas maybe you wouldn't necessarily want to receive words of affirmation in that way. I don't know. I got a little woo woo, but
yeah, no, I'm vaguely familiar with it. I've run into a couple of people who've tried to lay out the love languages thing for me, and definitely the words one is not my, I wouldn't score the highest in that category, but I wouldn't score zero either. But it's not the thing that gives me the most satisfaction. But the notion of like a meta cognitive relationship to those things is important, because we need to work well with each other, given the fact that we have these different response patterns.
Well said.
So what else is on that piece of paper of yours?
Well, I'm really lost on how we're doing on time. So, but I did jot a few things down.
Well, we have up to a half hour left, depending on what you want to do.
Okay. Well, I had some curiosities kind of that came up with me as a result, I'd say, or of some of these psychedelic experiences. And I'd like to maybe kind of go through some of them with you and see if any or some of them resonate, or if there's any interesting conversations that are sparked off of them. First, something that we were talking about in our SES group that I had the privilege of getting introduced to you in is, are our thoughts our own? Or are we a zeitgeist of perspective that would I don't want to say fatalistically, but perhaps determinatively come to certain thoughts or ideas because of an environmental factor or other determinative type of things in the time. And I without loading the question, I guess my feeling is that I tend to don't, like, if I had a great idea, I don't feel like I could take responsibility for that or copyright that or patent that as this is mine, and that I came up with this independently of all other factors. What do you think?
I think there's a lot of permeability to thoughts, right? I mean, it just in the most simplistic kind of way, we didn't learn language ourselves, right? All the words came from other people. So already at that level, it's imported into us. Certainly, we're responding to what's going on around us in the culture, which is currently throwing more mimetic information at us than any of our ancestors was built to be able to handle. There seems to be this sense in which we are largely an internal plurality. So even when it's being generated inside, it's being generated by a community of different subsystems and cells. And then there's this strong possibility, I think, a lot of at least the mystic phenomenology is such that if you just watch your own mind carefully, it does seem like the thoughts come in and then go out. And it may be that some of them are yours and some of them are not yours, right? And that percentage might differ from person to person. But I think we gain more sovereignty and agency and authenticity by trying to be aware of what might not be our own. We're trying to draw a line more carefully. However, I think it's important to, at the same time, like culturally, like you're saying, like maybe we don't need a culture where people take individualistic ownership of things just because they're the product of their own thinking and speaking system. But at the same time, maybe people need to stand for those, right? Maybe ideas need champions, right? So maybe somebody has to, in a way, say, this is mine, as a way of bringing those ideas into the world. If one of them comes across you and it's good, then maybe you are its chosen one. And by saying, this is my idea, as long as you don't say it too tightly, you're allowing yourself to be a servant to it in a more robust fashion.
Okay. All right. Well, I tend to agree with mostly everything you said there. But for the sake of wanting to kind of ask you, I've never had this opportunity to talk to you like this. So I'd almost like to get on to some of the other things. One thing that this cup is reminding me is, do you believe that magic can come back into our world in a way that we can be in awe of the world more? The example I'd like to show is they call a blue butterfly pea tea, and it has this beautiful blue color. And if I squeeze this lemon into it, it'll turn pink. Now, I can break it down scientifically, or maybe I couldn't right now, but if I did enough research, I could, tell you what the molecules are doing and why it isn't so special. But then it kind of takes the awe of it kind of out of it. And so I guess what I'm saying is, with my example is, do you feel like maybe we've become too specialized as a species? Because the division of labor, that was this big thing with us. Instead of us all being generalists, we're going to create cities by you digging trenches because you're better equipped at that, and you being a blacksmith because you're better equipped at that. And I'm wondering maybe if in the process of production, we have lost a sense of wonder and awe about the world because we've been able to explain it away.
I think we have lost something, and I think it is perfectly possible for that thing to return. I wouldn't put all of it on the shift of the means of production, but that's certainly a big player in the system. I think its influence over culture and education and over domestic life provides the sites at which we fail to teach ourselves the skills that produce the capacity for awe. And I think those skills are largely of two kinds. One is simply the practice of the emotions. I was part of a Buddhist community for a few years, and there was a lot of practice around getting better at the emotions you want to be able to have, right? So that awe isn't just a response, it's also a skill. How good are you at feeling awe? Well, that depends on how much time you've spent working on it, how long and how deep and how rich your nervous system has enabled you to tune into the awe frequency. All right, so we have to have things that afford us the opportunity to practice that particular emotion. But I think from my point of view, we also build up a surplus coherence through the integration of parts of our experience, right? So then we end up having a little more than we need just to run the system. And that more can then be sort of projected onto things, which gives us a deeper experience of them. So when we are impressed by beauty or awe or wonder or the overwhelming isness of something, we've facilitated that experience by adding our excess into the perception. But we can only do that in the degree to which our system is producing an excess, which means it has to make more than it needs, which means it has to hybridize its components rather than just responding to the world. So the more of our inner systems and aspects and feelings blend together, the more of this extra we have that then shows up in our experience of the world. So if we're teaching ourselves practices that cause us to build that quality up, then we'll find it everywhere we go. But if we're not doing those practices, we won't find it.
Do you think psychedelics can be a key tool with that particular?
Yeah, well, I think this is the way I initially thought about it when I was younger, was they show you what's possible. Now, there's other ways to get there, and they may not be the best ways to get there, but it's like watching a 5-minute video of Bermuda. You're not going to Bermuda, but you're like, this is what it would be like in Bermuda. And you're like, oh, wow, that looks pretty good. I now know that's a real possibility.
Mm. Great example.
And I think there's a way of balancing these things, right? There's a lot of talk about left-right brain balance and those sorts of things. And I think the metamodern integrative approach speaks to the need to get the resonant experiences and the analysis at the same time and worked together more closely. And that's important for two reasons. One is we still need the analysis, but we need the analysis to bend itself around the values that come out of these experiences. And if we just had these experiences without the analysis, we'd be like our ancestors and we'd be vulnerable to any new system, right? Why was it that modernity, despite all of its wonderful advances, was able to rob us of these experiences? Is because we weren't grounded enough. We weren't smart enough or intentional enough about how to have these. We were just having them. We weren't prepared to have them stolen. So we have to be able to have them and understand structural system dynamics together. All right. We need to be able to really know the chemistry of that drink and at the same time have none of the awe removed, maybe even have the awe amplified by that understanding.
Nice. What's your thoughts about, we were just talking about, autonomy of thoughts, and if somebody can claim a particular thought or perspective, and your perspective on that. And I think one of the key things that came from a lot of my psychedelic experiences is that we need to celebrate the unsung heroes of history in some way more than we are. We tend to celebrate these key figures or megalomatic type of rulers, or Alexander the Great, or so and so, but we don't celebrate his mother, or maybe that's not a good idea because Agrippina was a very popular figure, but there's a lot of unsung heroes in our human experience. Even a taxi driver, or somebody that picked up something you left on the train and tracked you down and gave it to you. And we have something called the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in America here, and I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, is to honor the people that were lost to the annals of history, and the what they've contributed to all of us being here, as related to prehistory and all of these things that we say we're interested in, before we could write down and pass these tales on to further generations. And what do you think about unsung heroes?
There's a lot of ways to go with that. It's a very beautiful, I think, very ethical idea. One of the things that always fascinated me was that the greatest inventors were so great we didn't even hear about them, right? It's one thing to go, Well, this guy invented the iPod. Fantastic. But who invented baking soda or the four-way stop? Or, I grew up on the coast. Like, who figured out you could just take used tires and hang them on the side of the boat for when it bangs against the dock? That's brilliant. It's so
Really?
brilliant that literally everyone with a boat immediately starts doing it as soon as they see it. It works so well. It works too well for us even to imagine it was invented by anyone. So
Right.
like the things we think of somebody coming up with are already a step down from the best inventions, right? Like no matter what you write in English, it's not going to be as amazing as the guy who invented the alphabet, and it
Right.
wasn't one guy, but that kind of the proto invention is more fabulous, more world transforming than things down the line. So I think there's that element to it. I think there's the importance of reminding us that there's always somebody or something we don't know. The unknown soldier. There's a great passage in the gospel where St. Paul goes among the Greeks and they have temples to all the gods. And he finds one that's listed to the unknown God. And he says, that's the God I'm talking about. So I think that's really important just to remind us that there's not only mystery, but whole classes of experiences that would deserve our value that we don't know about. And then this sense of who's been left out of history, right? And what a skewed sense of society we get because of who we don't value historically, and reciprocally, who we don't value historically because of the skewed society we're in now that reflects back upon that, right? All the work that doesn't get paid for doesn't get honored historically, and that is a limitation on the well-being and dynamism of our civilization, I think. And then the last piece of it would be honoring the wise, right? There's a few philosopher sages we've all heard about, but Alexander the Great, what did he do? Wreck a bunch of shit, right? And there were people there who were cultivating the ongoing legacy of the deepest human insights into well-being and into devices and into knowledge and into self-cultivation, into communities. Those things just got trashed. And those are the people we really should be honoring. And they're at jeopardy from periodic wars and conquerors and these sorts of things. So I think we need to be a little bit willing to be in pain for the loss of those things. Maybe I'd add one more thing, because I love Nietzsche. I love a certain reading of Nietzsche. And Nietzsche talked about this pain that he'd come across as he observed how seldom a human being flourishes, right? How many things have to go right for the greatness of a human being to come forward. And then how many times it went wrong and the plant never flowered. We don't see it because it didn't show up. It's what's missing from the record. And he talked about it as this special kind of pain when you start to appreciate how many times there could have been an enormous flowering and there wasn't.
Yeah, I've thought many times there's people like right on the cusp too, like I don't know if I'm saying her name correctly, but Hypatia, who was one of the last priestess of the Library of Alexander, and it's she had such an amazing life, and she stood for so much, and we barely know or honor her in this day, and she's not necessarily who we're highlighting here, because we do know her name, but people, as well as people that are unknown, but people that are under valued or underappreciated too.
There was I did a translation of Plato's Symposium, which should really be called the drinking party, which would be more interesting to students if they translated the term. But anyway, people talk about Plato, and I was like, well, he's just reporting what Socrates said. And in the Symposium, Socrates tells a story about how he was trained by this priestess, that she taught him the Socratic method, and she also taught him a contemplative approach to love, where you start with the things you desire and you refine your desire, and it generalizes up to the point where it fills the world, and then you merge with it. He runs through this at the end of the Symposium and says it was taught to him by this esoteric priestess in this particular cult. And scholars have dismissed this as, literary affectation. She was never real. But there's this character right there, and all the things we honor about Plato and Socrates, they're pointing at it coming from this woman, and she's virtually unknown, even though she's in the text.
It's a shame, really. Have you ever felt that you've channeled something or an entity or a higher being dimensionally as you've been talking or on any of these substances where, it's you, but it's also something else coming out?
That's a really vague territory for me. Say yes and no, sort of. There have been times, not so much with substances, but in certain kinds of trance states, in certain locations, I felt myself possessed by things, some of which I liked, some of which I didn't like. I've often had a sense of a plurality, a collective of elf-like entities that have shown up in different aspects of my life. I've had some run-ins with anomalous creatures, and I've done some experimental work, trying to get into the mediumistic state and do channeling, which intrigues me. I like the interesting effects and the strange streams of information that are produced by trying to hand your nervous system over to what seems like a stream of intelligence and energy from somewhere else. I'm very suspicious of the outputs, but I'm also very aesthetically pleased by them, and they open up a lot of opportunities, curiosities, and intrigues for me.
What's your take on like synchronicities and coincidences?
Yeah. It's funny that could be a real wide angle lens on that or a real narrow lens. Like, one of the things, my mother's husband, he asked me that when I first met him. I was actually doing a fake voice. So I remember meeting him very well because for a whole week I was doing a fake voice. So it's all very clear in my mind. Anyway, he asked about synchronicities, and I said, it's funny. I'm sitting in a chair, and at the same time the chair is holding together. That's pretty strange. Right? And what I was trying to say was the amount of meaningful coincidence is extraordinary. We just tune most of it out. Like the fact that we're here and that the computer's working and that I'm trying to breathe and the air happens to be still functioning. Like, all of these should be experienced as overwhelming synchronicities of heightened meaningfulness. But of course, that would overload us, so we tune that out. So I think the background of our experience is one of synchronicity that we just are strategically evading for the most part in order to be functional. Now, on top of that, there are certain kinds of standout experiences.
Right.
I heard Ken Wilber address this question in a very interesting way. And what he said was, when you're forming a new level, when the next holon is emerging in you, and the next holon, like the current one, is subjective, objective, singular, and plural all at once, that you're going to see these new patterns opening up. And what they represent is like another layer of your own intelligence coming online. So there's something about that I like. I've found myself over time not less impressed, but less compressed around them. Like, it's not that urgent that I note and try to decipher them. But I think that paying attention to what seems to you to be meaningful coincidences is one of the major tools for having a shamanic or psychophysical relationship to the world. I think Jung was definitely onto that in terms of, if you want to read reality in a richer way and access your best modes of relating to reality, then you have to follow those up. But you need some rule for doing it. I try to make a rule of 3 for myself, right? If a coincidence shows up, I'm not going to act on it. But if 3 of them occur and they're somehow connected, then I might try to take that as instruction in some sense.
What about, have you had those experiences where you have thought about a person and they call you later that day? Or same sort of thing. You think about a person and then you see them in the grocery store for the first time in 10 years. What do you make of those sorts of experiences? So most people I've talked to tend to think that they personally manifested those things later. And my take is pretty much the opposite, is that those things happened, and time is the present moment is an ever present moment. And we perhaps have a unique emotional body feeling of them in our presence, and what we thought was a random thought wasn't a random thought at all. It was us picking up on that particular thing. What's your take on that?
I do think there's a lot of almost childish narcissism in the idea that I'm the cause of things. Right now, it's an interesting experiment to see what sorts of effects you could have, but I think it sort of undermines the interestingness of the phenomenon to imagine that you're just manifesting it, and certainly doesn't seem to be true to the mutualistic and networked nature of reality as we now understand it. Where it shades between synchronicities and precognitive capacities, that's interesting. It pertains to how time is understood, right? Like when you think of, depends on whether you think the future is there, and then you have to break down different interpretations from that. But a lot of it is, I mean, if it was raining, the rain would be all over, right? I would get wet, but other people would get, and the dog would get wet, and the sidewalk would get wet. And I wouldn't think that was strange, because the phenomenon was a local atmospheric phenomenon. And I think a lot of more interesting informational and patterning phenomena are also like that. Like sometimes I was just down in Puerto Rico, and, you know, there's lizards on the road, but there's also like leaves and sticks on the road that are the same color and shape as the lizards, right? And they somehow conspired. They came from the same patterning source. When I was a kid, I remember there was a day I was playing soccer and I was going to go inside, and my friend was still playing soccer, and he said, "Can you hold my knife for me?" I put it in my pocket. It was Friday. I didn't give it back to him. It was still in my pocket the next day. Went out into the woods, went to a different area of the woods than we usually went, and I found the exact same knife stuck into a tree, a little bit rusty on the blade, and I took them out. They were identical knives. And so I kept one and gave one back to him. But that pattern, the shape of that knife, was somehow coming into the general situation. Right? So I think it's more interesting to think of these flows and streams and atmospheric concatenations of patterning than it is to think of I'm the modern individual market agent who just happened to be able to create this reality according to my selfish whims.
Yeah, and if I'm not rich, I didn't manifest it correctly.
That's right. And then the flip side of that is a really unhealthy blaming attitude, right?
Right.
And you are then responsible for every bad thing that happens if you are the manifester. So no one else has to have any sympathy for you. It's all your fault.
It's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah.
I know we're probably getting close to the time that you'd like to go to, but there's one, maybe two more things I'd like to ask you. Sure, if you don't
bring it.
I really relate to the work that you're doing with the non-duality. I see a rhythm or a melody of it in many of the different cultural traditions that I study. And to me, I feel, and through some of the things you've said in some of our groups and stuff, I understand. But I tend to think that sometimes people misunderstand the term duality with the term polarity. And I was wondering if you could maybe define or describe that a little bit for someone, I don't want to say like me, but maybe someone that is a Joe Schmo from Idaho as well as me.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure exactly what part of it you're thinking of, but for me, one of the most important insights in this is that, it's like we want to put the slash mark between non and duality, right? Because we're not talking about oneness as opposed to every kind of distinction you could make in the world. That's more what I think of as causal mysticism rather than non-dualism. In non-dualism, it is the very form of the duality that is itself unified, that the oneness pervades the difference. The difference is the site of the sameness. We need to be thinking philosophically in terms of same difference, but the most basic thing we can do is undo the sense of an absolute distinction between, say, one and two, between unity and duality. And where people have done their mysticism and their philosophy around rejecting the whole world of dualities and polarizations, first of all, they become less functional because they're not paying attention to the relational and the dynamic aspect of the world that comes through relationships, reciprocities, polarizations, currents, and things like that. But also they're making sort of a fundamental mystical mistake, which is they're denying themselves access to the thing that blends across the differences without canceling them, right? That all of this is the form of the oneness. It's not that oneness is the alternative to the manyness. The manyness is the very shape and form of the oneness. So undoing that sense of the distinction between those things is, to me, the liberating essence of non-duality.
I love hearing you talk, brother. I think sometimes, me personally, I've always kind of have some trouble with titles sometimes. And in the terms of what we were talking about earlier, postmodernism and metamodernism, where we're describing something that it is not. I think you know where I'm going with this. Is we use something that this new thing isn't to describe what it is. And in terms of non-duality, it's a term you see in a lot of Hindu or Vedic wisdom and all of that. And I think for modern, or I guess for contemporary people, describing something as non of what they understand a word to be can be a little bit confusing. And so I guess that was kind of also something that kind of comes up with that. But maybe it's not meant for everybody, perhaps, too.
Yeah, that's true. It may not be, although I would argue that the more we understand it, the more we see it applies to everything, whether we think of it as applying to those things or not. But it is an interesting question to ask why they said non-duality rather than oneness or nothingness, right? Something like that, right? So instead of saying there's a single homogeneous universal constitutive substance that's the fundamental reality, they're instead offering you a certain move where the duality is still there, but it's also transcended, right? They don't take duality out and say oneness. They keep the word duality, but they also offer you the chance to transcend it in the same moment. That to me is very fascinating. And I think it's important. Well, for me, it's important in an age which is kind of dynamic and computational, as the contemporary world seems to be, to think of it as a move rather than to think of it as a description of a block of reality, right? So it's not like here's the conditional world and here's the unconditional world that never changes. It's more like realizing a difference that matters and undoing the difference between it without canceling the difference, and being able to do that in every aspect of life. So it's not just that you can have experiences meditatively or through some substance where the experience was just everything was so super permeated by some kind of common factor that it was amazing. Yes, that's true. But to sit down in any moment of life or any moment of meditation and realize that the pressure between the differences that you're experiencing somehow can't really be there, right? So something's coming up for me and I go, how am I going to deal with this? Am I going to get more involved, or am I going to withdraw into my freedom? Am I going to try to escape it, or am I going to try to fight it? Am I going to be creatively engaged at the expense of my ease, or am I going to try to focus on my liberating ease at the expense of involvement? And to me, non-duality says no. It's just saying no to all of that. That's not the move. The move is those can't be different.
Right.
Somehow this is the liberation. Relationship is freedom. Engagement is ease and liberation. And so the move that cancels but doesn't wipe out the difference, that's the non-dual move. It's like a computational algorithm that can be applied again and again and again and build up to the beautiful fractal image.
So poetic, man. Something that comes up is what we think is, you know, polar or two is actually like subject and object. Perhaps there's also an observer. Perhaps there's a trinity, or, you know, in things that we find that can be reduced to, that there is something greater. There's that Shiva element. There's that of not being anything as a part of what we think is.
Yeah, there's two, I think, equally important ways to go when you confront what seems to be the limiting quality of a duality, right? One is to say, it both is and it isn't at every step. You're undoing that distinction. You go, well, what if there's a third thing? Yes, but also what if there isn't? And what if there is at the same time? You go down the non-dual road. But also there's a structural yogic energetic element to it where there is a third factor sometimes, right? And when we're dealing with non-duality, it's really radical. It undoes everything. When we're dealing with triangles, that's very productive. It's very dynamic. It's very agentic in a way. You know, wherever there's a relationship, there is some other thing, something that mediates the relationship, something that can come out of the relationship, an emergence between the two of us, or a third factor that allows any two things to cease just being two things and become poles in a reciprocal dynamic process. You don't have an electrical flow with just a positive and negative pole. You've got to have a connector, you've got to have a current, then you have a phenomenon when that third thing is involved.
Wow. Hey, Layman, I'm so blessed to be able to have a conversation with you today. I've wanted this in many ways for a long time, and although I only got about 3 lines on my list of like 30 I wanted to talk to you about, I'm so grateful to have come into your path and for you to come into mine. So yeah, man, very much.
Well, maybe we'll do another one and follow up on the rest of your list, but it was great going through this with you and getting to know you, and absolutely lovely flavor. I've had a wonderful time, Cole. Thank you.
Likewise, Layman. Thank you.